Americans, why is it normal to leave your parents' house at 18, and how do you have enough money to rent a house at that age? Because we go to college, university, at 18 or 19, and that's often far from the parents' home. People who may not be moving out at that age. No one buys a house at that age, more likely have a not nice apartment or live in a dorm on campus. Students often have parents helping pay for school, including housing, and have student jobs, and take out grants and loans from the school or the government. There's definitely a cultural push towards independence and individualism in the US. Sometimes it's a good thing, other times it means that you live on your buddy's couch for a while after your stepdad begins charging you rent the day you turn 18. Just to clarify, it is not normal for American parents to kick their kids out at 18. I've literally never once heard of this happening to anyone, and if I did, the response would be holy shit, your parents are awful people. I am aware it happens, but it's an extremely rare thing that only terrible parents do. Kids move out at 18 because they want to, because America has a strongly individualist culture, and also because, like many others have said, lots of us left home at 18 to go to college and move into the dorms. Also, no one buys a house at 18. You rent a shitty house or a shitty apartment with a bunch of other people and you barely afford it. They are either being funded by their parents to live near their school, living in dorms, or have a bunch of roommates. Most people who move out but aren't going to college fall into the bunch of roommates category. Pretty much all of them actually. I think less people move out at 18 than it seems like, but it is a lot more than in other countries. I know for most people I knew it was the kids thinking, I can't wait to move out and be independent, have freedom, do what I want to, have privacy from my parents. Others get kicked out at 18. I left when I was 19, mostly because I wanted to get out on my own and have the privacy and freedom I didn't have with my mom. How did I afford it? I worked 2 jobs, did evenings at a large big box store, not Walmart, and then went straight to my overnight job at a gas station. It sucked working so much, but looking back over 10 years later I would do it again. You don't lol. Seriously. When I was graduating high school, I had a lot of friends that were saying their parents were kicking them out the next day. Instead of celebrating a huge milestone in life, most of them were looking for roommates so they could afford an apartment any bigger than a coffin. To those of you whose parents kicked them out or said things about leaving at 18, I am so sorry. My children will always be welcome in my home. I hope they do move out and experience life on their own, but I will never complain about having them close to me. The only friends I had that immediately left their parents' home either went to college and lived on campus or went in the military. The others lived with their parents for several more years, at least until they could afford an apartment. Even the ones that went in the military or college still stayed with their parents when they had breaks. So I don't know if it's normal, but it's an option. I moved out at 18 because I have an abusive brother who stole my stuff constantly, and my mom continues to support him to this day because he is her son. He's about to be 30, mind you. I have been independent my whole adult life and paying for my own things since I was 15. In my 30s I am at a big disadvantage from other people my age who got to stay at home and save all those years. I wish I could have stayed at home, but I really had to decide if it was worth my mental well-being. I curb stomped my brother when I found him sleeping in the basement after the nth time he stole from me, having pawned off all my and my sister's gold jewelry, and my mom kicked him out of the house, but he somehow got back in. It kind of sucks. My sister works harder than anyone I know, making big money, and she's in the same situation as me, having to build herself up from nothing. Even with a year in grade school she got to skip, she is still many standard milestones behind her friends, because she left the house at 17. During the turn of the 20th century, independent living was seen as a luxury to the greatest generation and multi-generational housing was the norm, but in the wake of an emerging modern middle class, was beginning to be seen as a sign of low class. The silent generation used it as something to aspire to. The early bohemian and beatnik thinkers of the time praised it in their art and ideology. More importantly, when they returned home from WW2, the government made it very cheap and easy for everyone to buy homes, and the prevalence of unions, high wages, and pensions made it easy to keep those homes on a single income. Their independent living was a sign of their victory over literal evil, in addition to a symbol of their economic triumph over the multi-family farmhouses they all grew up in. Even if this economic triumph was more related to the economy and labor policy than it was their individual effort, it was easier back then. The baby boomers, who in their heyday were forward-thinking progressive, for the time, optimists, used it as a means to an end, a way of escaping the conservative traditionalism of their parent. Why wouldn't they want to escape the bubble of their parents, who chain-smoked Chesterfields, looked on in horror at the queers, and refused to listen to popular music if the musicians involved didn't wear suits on stage? Generation X was split. Half did it to escape their parents, the other half did it because they were yuppies who could afford it. They came of age at a time of massive economic opportunity. If you had a college education, which was still cheap back then, plummeting minimum wages, shuttered factories, dying unions, and extinct pensions made independent living harder, especially for high school grads, but it was still feasible, and downright easy if you got rich during one of the several pre-2000 dot-com booms. Millennials faced the reality in which the ideal collapsed in on itself. Nobody can afford to move out at 18 anymore. Rents have skyrocketed, home prices are insane, healthcare and education cost a fortune, and nobody is interested in hiring an early 20s college graduate, let alone a late teens high school grad. But earlier generations don't see that. All they see is a generation that is lazy, and doesn't try hard enough. God save Generation Z. My parents pulled that shit on me, acting like they didn't have any help when they were young, but in reality they did, both of them. My dad didn't move out of his mom's house until he was 27 because he was a lazy ass. My mom moved out early when she married her high school sweetheart who was in the military during Vietnam. She lived on a military base and got help from my grandparents during and after her marriage to him. I feel like they feel better living this light of exceptionalism that doesn't exist. It's not practical, and the American dream is not attainable without attacking the ideal of home ownership as a unit, whether it be from instruction and help throughout high school and college, or while they establish themselves in a career. Families succeed when they support each other all the way. I think American families are switching to this philosophy. It's not anymore lol. Pretty much no 18-year-old without any financial help can be financially independent in 2021. Why is that an American thing? I live in Germany and I moved out at around the same age. As for the money, I had some jobs besides studying and could barely make it. More freedom and independence, and don't believe everything you read on Reddit. The US is far from some dystopian hellscape of endless extreme poverty and impossible economic catch-22s. I paid my own rent, gas, groceries, utilities, and going out money, all while working and going to school. My mom did help with auto insurance, though I didn't really need her to. I waited tables, and it was plenty to get me by in my college days. And no one really buys or rents a house at 18, at least not by themselves. Most rent an apartment, and they usually do it with friends to help defray the cost. It's not necessarily normal, but many kids want to. I had a reasonably decent home life and childhood, but my desire to grow up, live on my own, have a social life that wouldn't be daily criticized, etc. Eventually overcame my desire to have no bills to pay and someone to always do my laundry for me. To be fair, there's nothing wrong with staying at home for a while, especially if you're working full plus time and saving, investing most of your income. Do it right, and a few years in the beginning can lay the foundation for a huge retirement fund and virtually guarantee never having to deal with debt. But if you're living up to the stereotype of living in mom's basement playing video games all day, then yes, you need to grow up and move out. Honestly, I don't think it's as common as the title implies. While some are very eager to move out and get into adulting, others absolutely dread the idea and will do anything possible to delay it. A real pity that people always jump to insults towards those who go this route instead of trying to understand where they're coming from. Us Americans who didn't go to college cause it was never in the cards, the key was a roommate or some ridiculous overtime. Though looking back, doing an apprenticeship in a trade would have been a good idea that would have paid reasonably well. I left at 19, worked 2 jobs after graduation, saved up enough to buy an okay car, went to trade school with a friend who I rented an apartment with along with one other student. Every month I only had about $200 of disposable income after I paid all of my bills. Parents were no help and I had minimum financial assistance. Because who wants to live with their parents till they're 25? I lived at home through college, which isn't terribly unusual. Then I moved out on my own. I had enough money to rent a crappy duplex because I was working a full-time job. Nothing more complicated than that. The duplex was like 400 square feet or something. It was tiny and drafty and I couldn't afford to heat and cool it adequately. There were summer nights I slept on the floor in the bathroom because the tile was cool, and there were winter nights when I got off work and just piled a ton of blankets on me, and that's how I was until it was time for work the next day. This is how it is when you start out. Some people do. Some don't. After high school I lived with my parents for 2 years while I went to a very cheap local community college. Then I transferred to a large in-state university where I rented a house right off campus with 2 other guys. 3 years later I had graduated, gotten married, and we lived in a cheapish apartment for about 2 years before buying our first home. I think every single one of my friends either lived with parents or a relative for some period of time after graduating high school or split a cheap apartment with a friend or 2. No one had money to buy a house until many years later, if they even have a house yet. When I turned 17 I joined the Navy delayed entry, and then when I graduated HS, off to boot camp I went. They never forced me to do anything and I wasn't in a hurry to move out, but I was in a hurry to have a plan. I hated school and we didn't really have the money for me to go to college, so the Navy seemed to be my best course of action, and it was. I'm sure my parents would have let me stay for as long as I needed to get on my feet and figure it out for myself. Definitely wasn't hard for me to move out at 18. I worked full-time since 16, so I had money saved and I was able to move in with my boyfriend to save on rent. We rented a tiny place in a not-so-great area for $500 a month, so my part was only $250 a month. Only thing that sucked about moving out at 18 was I had to work 40 hours a week to support myself and also go to cosmetology school 40 hours a week. It was exhausting and left not time for anything. My boyfriend, he's now my hubby, also had to work full-time and go to school, though he only did 20 hours of school a week, not 40. But my parents pretty much told me I had to move out or pay them rent, so I had no choice. Had to work either way. Figured I'd rather move out instead paying them. Also, it worked out. We were able to get married at 22 and buy a home at 23, but we worked super hard for this goal. This was back in 2010 though, when homes were a lot cheaper. We bought for $160K and sold our home for $275K this year, so definitely a lot harder to do this now. I got kicked out at 19. I got a dog and my mom didn't like it, said either the dog had to go, or the dog and I both had to go. It really gave me the push I needed to become more responsible. I'm 25 now and own a home with a huge yard that my dog, who is now 6, absolutely loves. Man, reading this thread makes me love my mom even more. I had to provide budgets and proof that I could survive moving out while she was still trying to hold on to me staying at home. I couldn't imagine having to survive then without that safety net. I left at 17 and I didn't have enough money for anything. I busted my ass to earn a living. I stayed in my car for a while. I put in time, blood, sweat, and tears in the most literal sense. I am now doing very well. I'm happy. It wasn't easy. Some people have parents help for much longer even if they are moved out. Every situation is different for every person. I grew up in a poor to working class area. Kids were expected to be starting their adult lives by the time they turned 18 or finished high school. Many started earlier. Lots of kids lived at home after high school as long as they were earning and contributing to the family finances. Some from more privileged families were allowed to go to college while living at home, but if not working at least part-time, they were required to contribute in other ways, caring for younger siblings, household chores, etc. I wasn't able to move out independently until I turned 20 because it took that long to get my finances together. You either go to college, accrue massive debts and live on, near campus, or have that sweet scholarship money. If you don't go to college, you find roommates and live in an apartment built in the 70s. Not too many people leave their parents' house at 18. I would say most end up leaving between 21-25 years old. It is definitely a grind either way. The most common answer is because of college. But in reality most people I know didn't move out until they are 21, 22, and even the ones that left for college still end up moving back in with their parents for a bit. I live in a resort town in Montana and here we have low pay and a really high cost of living, making it extremely hard to move out at 18. So most people will live with their parents till they save up the money. I think that this idea of moving out at 18 is from older generations saying they were able to move out due to lower cost of living, and here in the US we have ingrained into our heads of the idea of being completely independent from our parents because older generations were able to. I didn't. I went to a college about 8 blocks away from my parents' house, so I continued to live with them while I went to college. Then, as I went through a series of shitty-paying jobs, I lived with them even after that. I didn't move out until I was 34. It's because baby boomers like me were able to do it because we had a livable minimum wage and low tuition costs. And many are too benighted to understand that things have changed. My dad lived in his mother-in-law's house all the way through medical school. He was born in 1935. I never judge young people who live with their parents. Times have changed. Because our parents actually hate us. Speaking for the millennial generation, most of our parents were yappy boomers that were just having kids because their friends were having kids. We get kicked to the curb at the first opportunity they have to go back to day drinking. No one has enough money at that age. We end up with 4 or 6 people in a small house to split rent so we can all have a roof over our heads, or we become homeless. This is why the rate of young homeless people is so fucking high in this country. It's just a thing. 18 isn't the set date, but I've seen friends stay until they were in their late 20s and they're deadbeats to this day. No ambition, used to just living off mom and dad. I had a sense of pride and wanted to actually be independent. The honest answer is most leave, but they are broke. They struggle to eat and pay rent, and after 50 years of this just die without any savings. The middle class might go to college and then work and still die without savings. Americans are not as well off as the TV makes it seem.